Welcome to BachTalk. I'm Carlton Monroe, your host. Glad you can join me for this webinar on Bach and Bach's music as we look forward to an upcoming Vespers performance by the Bach Ensemble of St. Thomas. With me, as always, is my friend Adam Shoaff. Adam, nice to see you.
Nice to see you again, Carlton.
And we're joined by two special guests. And those are Soprano Josefien Stoppelenberg, right
Hello.
there, and baritone David Rugger. David,
Hi.
nice to see you. Yeah. So Josephine is coming to us from Chicago. Yes.
I am. There's a lot of snow here. I don't know the weather in Cincinnati, but I hope it's better than here in Chicago.
Marginally better, I think, is
Okay.
the fair thing to say. It's been today was a really nice day. It was really beautiful here. And David is joining us from Indianapolis. Am I?
Yep.
Indianapolis.
From Indy.
We are covering the Midwest for this Bach Talk podcast. So anyway, I'm glad you're here joining us. I'm excited to hear more about the cantata that we are going to be performing on Sunday, and then a chance to talk more with Josephine and David about the work that they do. So with all of that, we're going to turn it over to our friend Adam. Adam, why don't you take it away?
All right. Gladly. Go ahead and commandeer the screen here. And welcome everyone back to Bach Talk. If you could go back in time and hear one musical event, what would you pick? Maybe the premiere of Handel's Messiah or Beethoven's Ninth Symphony? Or maybe something non-classical, like the opening of A Little Night Music on Broadway, or Miles Davis at the Birdland Cafe. I've often thought that if I could travel back in time and be a fly on the wall, I'd visit Leipzig in the mid-1720s, just so that I could witness the environment in which Bach premiered the majority of his sacred cantatas. I think it would be fascinating, not just to hear Bach's chorus and orchestra, but to observe the congregation during the service. Today's Bach Talk is meant to take you back in time to 18th century Leipzig, or at least give you that impression. When I first mentioned this topic last fall, I called today's discussion A Typical Sunday in 1724. And the reason that I can approach this topic is because scholars have done so much work on Leipzig's religious life in the 18th century and documented it in such detail that you can easily imagine yourself there in the St. Thomas Church or in St. Nicholas listening to Bach. So today's special topic is less about Bach and more about his listeners, the people who heard his cantatas for the first time. Now, you might be wondering, why should we bother with the anonymous crowd? Well, for one, I think you might find their church-going habits interesting, both for the behaviors that will seem familiar to modern congregations, as well as the discontinued practices that might strike us as a little bit strange. I also think that studying Bach's congregations can give us even more insight into his music. After all, Bach wrote his cantatas to inspire devotion in his listeners. And so today we'll take a few minutes to look a little more closely at those listeners. Now, before I jump in, I do want to acknowledge the work of one particular scholar. Tanya Kevorkian has written extensively about music and religion in Leipzig during Bach's time. Her most expansive work is her book Baroque Piety, Religion, Society, and Music in Leipzig, 1650 to 1750. And then she's written other articles on similar themes. Usually whenever I put together these Bach Talk lectures, I rely on a variety of sources. For today, however, I drew most of my material from Dr. Kevorkian, and so it seemed appropriate to give credit where credit is due. So now then, if you could time travel back to Leipzig, 1724, what would you have experienced? Well, on Sunday mornings, the tolling of church bells would have beckoned you and the other townspeople to services, which began at 7 a.m. The wealthy arrived in their carriages, while everyone else came on foot. Churches were generally full on Sundays, especially during holidays and outside of the summer. At St. Nicholas and St. Thomas, the two largest churches in Leipzig and the places where Bach premiered his cantatas, this meant 2,500 people in the pews, with 500 more in additional seating or standing. By today's standards, these would be megachurches. Other churches in the city, such as the New Church, St. Paul's, and the University Church, could accommodate anywhere from a few hundred up to 1,200 parishioners. In all, approximately 9,000 people out of the city's total population of 30,000 were in church on Sunday mornings. Upon arrival at church, most families headed for their pews, but family members didn't actually sit together. This is because at St. Nicholas and St. Thomas, sections of pews were divided by gender. Women sat on the ground floor, and men sat either above them in the balcony seats or in the few pew seats around the perimeter of the ground floor. Not only were congregations separated by gender at the two largest churches, but class distinctions were also reflected in the seating arrangements. The truth is that pews cost money. They were considered a form of property, held within a family, and congregations could be very territorial about them, especially since the demand for pews always exceeded the supply. It kind of reminds me a little bit of demand for season tickets, like at Lambeau Field or at Wrigley Field. And subletting of pews at the time was a common practice. As we might expect then, wealthier parishioners made up a disproportionate number of pew holders at St. Nicholas and St. Thomas. Tanya Kevorkian has dug through the numbers and found that about 43% of pew holders at St. Nicholas and St. Thomas belonged to the Leipzig elite, despite the fact that they made up only 10% of the city's population. These were the merchants, the professionals, the city councilors and their families. A smaller group of less wealthy shopkeepers and notaries, which Kevorkian calls an intermediate class, claimed 14% of the pews. And then the final 43% of pews went to artisans, that is, bakers, saddlers, smiths, and their families. And this number, 43%, equaled their representation in Leipzig society. So if we quickly do the math, 43% plus 14% plus 43% equals 100%, meaning that all of the pews were held by members of Leipzig's upper and middle classes. As for the unpropertied servants, the laborers, the city's poor, visitors to town, or members of the wealthier classes who hadn't obtained a pew, they were obliged to stand in the crowd at the rear of the church, which, as I said earlier, numbered around 500 people in the large churches. Because of this, Leipzig's lower classes usually attended afternoon services at St. Nicholas and St. Thomas, or morning services in the smaller churches. But let's go back to the pew holders for just a moment, because this group reflected subdivisions within the upper classes. There were actually two types of pews. There were regular seats, or Stände, which were arranged in blocks, and then there were benches, or Bänklein, which were attached to the sections of Stände. As you might guess, nearly 2/3 of the Stände, or the seats, were held by the elites. By contrast, over 80% of the Bänklein, the benches, were held by the artisans. And then starting around 1700, Leipzig's wealthiest parishioners began enclosing 10 to 12 pews around the edges of the churches. And these closed-off areas were known as Kapellen. Kevorkian notes that there were over 30 of these Kapellen in each of the two main churches, either on the ground floor around the sides or up in the balconies. These Kapellen ringing the sanctuary thus resembled opera boxes, and they fulfilled the same kind of segregating social function within a very class-conscious society. If you, as the time traveler, had arrived and settled into your pew, you would have then taken notice of the pageantry of the service. Churches were richly decorated in the early 18th century. Clerics and altar servers wore green, white, red, and violet vestments of silk, satin and velvet, trimmed with gold and silver thread. The carriers of the collection bags wore uniform black coats. The balconies were decorated with large statues and paintings. A new altar made of red, black, and white marble with a large sunburst on it was installed at St. Thomas in 1721, just 2 years after Bach's arrival. And then the massive organs in St. Nicholas and St. Thomas drew attention for their remarkable craftsmanship. And then finally, holidays brought out additional decorations. And of course, the music was more elaborate than usual. As a time traveler of the 21st century, one thing that might come as a culture shock is the length of the service, which ran for at least 3 hours. The first hour included chants and a motet by Bach's choir, hymns sung by the congregation, scripture readings, and the cantata. Then began the sermon, the liturgical focal point of the service, and that lasted a full hour. The third portion of the service featured communion, accompanied by more hymns or maybe a second cantata, and then announcements, prayers, and a final blessing. This third part of the service took at least an hour, and sometimes closer to 2 during the holidays. It appears that not everyone took communion, though, every Sunday. Christoph Wolff has noted that Bach and his family took communion at St. Thomas's only about twice a year. So then this slide shows a more detailed breakdown of the order of events in one of Bach's church services. And this was the prescribed order in each of Leipzig's churches, as laid out in a couple of liturgical guides printed in the previous decade, back in the 1710s. Now, this seems like a long list, but I've even left out a number of items that were added during the Lenten season or for holidays. I've marked the main cantata, Bach's cantata, there in red. As you can see, it came just before the sermon. Another fascinating aspect of Leipzig church attendance at this time was the frequency of late arrivals and early departures. Now, in a way, I can sympathize with those people, given the long duration of the service, the long period of standing for those who couldn't get a pew, and the fact that during the winter, 7 a.m. services began before daylight. Also, the churches were unheated, making it difficult to stick around between late autumn and early spring. The early 20th century musicologist Arnold Schering once noted that even Bach himself apparently arrived late to the services sometimes. However, there was also an element of social display in the tardiness. By arriving fashionably late, people could make a grander entrance when they did arrive. And this was also something that happened at contemporary opera houses too. Generally, people wanted to be present for the sermon, which, as I said, was the high point of the service. And many also left immediately after the sermon because they didn't want to wait around for communion to be administered to all those people. Now, as we saw on the last slide, if the congregation wanted to be in attendance for the sermon, they were most likely in place then for Bach's cantata, which, as we saw, occurred not too long before the sermon. With all this coming and going, it's no surprise to learn that churches in Bach's day were probably noisier places than mainline American churches are today. In the large churches, there was apparently a variety of activity during the service. People observed one another and greeted their friends when they arrived. There were some complaints about gossiping and laughing during the service. From the balcony pews, men and students could observe the women below, and they courted the unmarried women by visiting them at their pews. There's also evidence of youthful troublemaking. Youths were criticized for going behind the capellan around the outside of the sanctuary to make noise. And an electoral decree of 1722 actually forbade students from throwing objects from the balcony down onto the women's pews. Now, I don't want to mischaracterize things. In describing some of these interesting behaviors, I don't want to give the impression that Leipzig churches were some kind of circus every Sunday morning. We have to remember that these are very large buildings with a lot of people inside, so a certain amount of noise was not going to disrupt the service. And there's still plenty of devotion going on, too. People listen carefully to the clerical oratory of the sermons. Hymns were an important means by which congregants could participate in the service. It appears that audiences listened attentively to the cantatas as well. Starting in the 1710s, before Bach moved to Leipzig, librettos were sold for performances of cantatas so that the congregants could follow along with the words, just as we might follow along with the words in a CD booklet. These librettos were available for a small price in bookstores, or people could buy them at the church door. We also know that some parishioners sang along with the cantata chorales sung by Bach's choir, and this isn't surprising since these chorales were some of the most well-known melodies of their day. On the whole, one of the observations that stands out to me after exploring the Baroque Sunday service is how much of their secular world they brought into their religious ceremony. And in a way, to me, it kind of recalls Bach's use of secular music styles borrowed from opera or dance in his sacred cantatas. For Leipzig's audiences, the sacred and the secular mixed in such a way that the socializing aspect of churchgoing existed alongside the ability to experience a sense of wonder and devotion. However, Tanya Kevorkian points out that this Baroque style of worship faded away not long after Bach's death in 1750. The 7 Years' War, which lasted from 1756 to 1763, brought economic turmoil to Leipzig, and other social currents swept away the older practices. Social activities like the Gewandhaus concerts and the re-establishment of public opera in Leipzig gave the public other outlets for socializing. And then Enlightenment rationalists criticized what they saw as the excessive pomp and the needless ceremony within the religious service, which in their minds distracted from the divine word. The late 18th century thus brought about major changes in Leipzig's religious life. Nevertheless, learning about Bach's Leipzig cantatas allows us to see his cantatas in a new light. For example, if we know that Bach's audience included a large contingent of well-to-do listeners, people who understood operatic music or who played keyboard dance music for domestic recreation, then we can see Bach's use of operatic or French dance styles not only as a response to musical trends, but also as a way of communicating with an audience that was enjoying peace and prosperity in the latest fashions. We can also see Bach's cantatas as vivid, attention-grabbing sermons meant to cut through the noise of 3,000-member congregations and to speak to each individual listener and inspire them to faith in a highly dramatic way. In fact, I think we can see that attention-grabbing quality in today's cantata with its series of colorful arias. So with that quick pivot, let's take a look at Selig ist der Mann, BWV 57, to get you ready to listen to it next week. This cantata was part of Bach's third cantata cycle, which he completed over the course of 2 years, 1725 to 1727. It premiered on the second day of Christmas, December 26th, 1725. The libretto was by Georg Christian Lems. Bach likely never met Lems, who died in 1717, but Bach had in his possession a yearly cycle of cantata poetry that Lems had written in 1711, the Gottgefälliges Kirchenopfer, or God-pleasing church offerings. Bach had used this poetry for a couple of his Weimar cantatas, and he pulled it off the shelf again now for several cantatas in his third Leipzig cycle. Selig ist der Mann is what we sometimes call a dialogue cantata. Unlike most of Bach's cantatas, which begin with a substantial movement for full chorus, followed by solo movements for all 4 voice parts, this dialogue cantata instead presents a running dialogue across the movements between Jesus, sung by a bass soloist, and the soul, sung by a soprano. This dialogue format was not Bach's original idea. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, dialogue goes back to the Song of Solomon. Dialogue and allegorical representations appeared frequently during the Baroque era, and Jesus' soul dialogues were especially popular in 17th century Lutheran Germany. Heinrich Schütz, Dietrich Buxtehude, and earlier members of the Bach family all composed several of these dialogues. Bach thus inherited the dialogue tradition, and he employed elements of dialogue even from his earliest cantatas. Even in Leipzig, he had already featured dialogues during his first cantata cycle, including in BWV 60, 66, and 59. So this dialogue was a familiar format for Bach. But what's the appeal of the dialogue cantata? Why would Bach write these? Well, they have the effect of taking theological ideas and dramatizing them in vivid ways. It's one thing to hear the senior pastor sermonize for an hour about Christ and the soul. It's another, though, to hear Christ and the soul singing to each other in kind of a miniature drama. It makes the discussion more real, in a way, when you hear it acted out. And so for the average listener sitting in the pew, listening to Bach's music and following along with their libretto, the average listener then has an opportunity to kind of tune out the rest of the congregation and identify with the role of the soul. And this was Bach's goal, to inspire and persuade the listener to faith through these musical sermons. Dialogue cantatas also provide opportunities for very dramatic music that reflect the shifting moods of the dialogue participants. Here's a list of the movements in Selig ist der Mann. As you listen next week, take note of the remarkable variety of moods or affects that Bach displays. In the opening aria, Jesus sings, "Blessed is the man, Selig ist der Mann, who endures temptation." And the music features the bass voice, Jesus, singing very long notes on Selig. In other words, presenting a model of endurance, while the instrumental parts twist around each other, I think kind of sort of serpent-like, in a web of chromatic descent and dissonance that I think perhaps represents the external pressures of temptation. In the second aria, Ich wünschte mir den Tod, or I would wish for my death, the soprano, the soul, considers life without Jesus' love in a minor key movement of remarkable anguish. The turning point of the cantata occurs in the fourth movement recitative, Ich reiche dir die Hand, or I reach out my hand to you, as Jesus pledges to the soul his heart and hand, and the soul takes confidence in its victory over temptation. After this, Jesus returns for another aria, Ja, ja, ich kann die Feinde schlagen, or Yes, I can smite the enemies. The music here is fast and martial, and Jesus' wide-ranging arpeggios and virtuosic melismas show him as this swaggering, conquering hero. And it's exactly the kind of music that contemporary audiences would have heard at the opera, sung by a secular victorious hero. The final aria, movement number 7, sung by the soul, gives us yet another mood. This one is more of a dance style, and we can hear the lightness of this dance even in the aria's title. It's kind of sing-songy. Ich ende, behende mein irdisches Leben, or I nimbly end my earthly life. And Bach often drew on dance references to symbolize the confidence and joy of faith. So as you listen to this cantata next week, I encourage you to remember Bach's own Leipzig audience. I know that I've looked at this cantata differently over the past couple of weeks as I've been reading about Bach's congregation. When I think about those packed Leipzig churches, so stratified by social class, but united in their common awareness of operatic, dance, and religious music. And when I also think of Bach's aim to capture all of their attention and to impart a theological message through lively and powerful music, I think it all makes Bach's compositional choices take on a new significance. For me, the music seems to come alive a little bit more. For our little cultural study about church going in 18th century Leipzig has piqued your interest, I thought that I would post Tanya Kevorkian's book again, Baroque Piety, which, as I said earlier, came out in 2007. She also has another book coming out, Music and Urban Life in Baroque Germany. And get this, by sheer coincidence, it just happens to be coming out this week. Amazon says it's due for release on March 2nd, 2022. So hot off the presses. According to the book's summary, it is accessible to non-music specialists, so I thought that it would make a great recommendation for the BachTalk audience. And so with that, I think that's going to bring my portion to the end. I think we're going to hear from Jesus and the soul now.
That's right. Thank you, Adam. As always, that was fascinating. I particularly loved the information about the congregation and the circumstances surrounding liturgical life. Honestly, there were so many things that I could say happened pretty regularly at St. Thomas Terrace Park every Sunday morning, particularly the socializing in the pews. That's something I've seen.
I'm sure families usually go sit in their usual places.
Oh, it's almost assigned seating. Yeah, unofficial assigned seating in places.
Yeah.
So.
At least people don't have to buy them nowadays. But,
that's right.
Yeah.
Well, that was really wonderful. Thank you for sharing all of that. So, David and Josephine, welcome back. I'm excited to speak to you a little bit about this cantata that Adam has already given us some wonderful background into. So my first question, and Josephine, I'll start with you first. It's great to have two singers here because I want two singers that sing a lot of Bach, because I'm excited to hear how you approach a new piece of music. So I don't know if this cantata was new to you prior to this, but if it wasn't, I'd love to just hear your approach. If I called you up and said, hey, I'd like you to come sing cantata, whatever, and it's not one you've ever performed before, what is your approach? What does it look like, Josephine?
Well, I'm very excited to do this particular cantata because I had never done it. I had heard it often and I had practiced through that first aria that is well known in soprano land because it's just so beautiful. And in fact, I think there's only one more solo soprano cantata that we had scheduled at some point to do, and then I would have done all the solo soprano cantatas, but I'll get there someday.
We'll put it on the list.
Put it on the list, yes. But for me, it basically starts with what I call like practicing two different pillars. Like one is the technical aspect of Bach, and it's kind of a steep hill usually because he writes in almost an instrumental way for the voice. There's very little time to breathe. It takes me quite a time to really set it into my voice and feel really confident that the music will sort of flow through me. So that's kind of the technical aspect of it. And the other part is more like the emotion, like what Adam said, what's the message that the audience needed to get? What is it that they needed to take home? A renewed sense of faith, or what is the narration? So you kind of try to infuse that technical solidity with the narration and the emotion. So it feels like you're sort of improvising it, narrating it in the spot. That's kind of always the sort of balancing act for me with Bach. And of course, really looking at the text, because that's just so essential.
Do you, I want to ask David the same question, but before I do, I'm curious, do you sit at the piano? Do you listen? At what point do you listen to recordings, or do you listen to recordings? How does that factor into your?
It depends. I mean, some cantatas I have just heard already, so they're a little bit in my ear. If it's a new cantata, I usually start it out myself and kind of figure it out. But I will listen to some recordings like at a later stage to see what other people are doing, if there's some things I want to steal from them interpretation-wise, or just to get a little bit in my ears how it all goes together. I can play in the piano in a very simple sort of way. I can manage. I can play the violin quite well. Piano is a little hunkety-clunkety, if that's good. But I can manage. So it's a balance of I want to get quite far with it myself and then listen to it to see if I missed anything or add some other ideas.
David, what about you? When did you know this cantata before this?
I was aware of it. I hadn't sung it yet, so this is also my
Okay.
first time with it. No, and I'm kind of a guy who needs a process, so I devised one. I start with the readings because I need to know what I'm singing about, and then I move on to the libretto because I want to know how I'm reacting to something. Um, I mean, obviously you need to know what you're singing about, but if you just look at the libretto and don't know your like readings for the day, it's like reading a really good sequel or watching a really good sequel and you haven't watched the first one, so you're getting some really great stuff, but you're just missing out on half of it.
Yeah.
Um, and then usually I look for just some really basic things like what's the basic musical treatment? How is Bach responding to the libretto that responds to the readings? And then it's, figuring out how to get it into my body. So there's like a lot of piano and metronome and honestly swearing until it turns into something musical and functional. Yeah.
Right. Right. No, I get that too. I'm always for me recordings are kind of a love hate thing because
Mm.
I try. It's hard for me to. I try to avoid them early in the process of getting to know a new cantata. And this was instilled in me by one of my earliest conducting teachers, because I felt like the moment you started to hear a recording, that became the baseline that you reacted to, as opposed to first having the opportunity to make some choices yourself, like just you and the page. And so I don't always do this. There are plenty of times where I've started with the recording first, and I'm sure that the final performance ended up sounding very much inspired by whatever recording I heard. But I try to avoid them early on in the process, I think. I loved what you talked about with studying the original readings too. One of the things I find fascinating is that there are there have been numerous times where I've read the readings for the day and thought to myself, okay, if I was going to write a cantata on this, here's what I would do. Here's what I would emphasize. Here's the point, right? And then I've gone to look at the cantata and realized that Bach has chosen to go in a completely different direction. And in fact, sometimes has picked up on something that I completely missed, and focused on that. And even maybe in a few occasions I've thought have even turned the reading upside down just a little bit, almost as if, I don't know, I can sense either Bach or the librettist putting their own little twist onto readings like that.
Pretty cool.
Yeah, it strikes me sort of like a gloss on a gloss on a gloss,
Yeah.
which in like non-medievalist terms is sort of like you have an original text and then you have a comment. I mean, it's very much something that we can be familiar with social media. It's like a hot take on a hot take on a hot take, and occasionally we
Right.
get back to the original. I'm not like reducing Bach down to like
Oh,
some
I'm
social
going to
media
use that.
influencer.
We're using that. That's how we're going to sell tickets right there.
Great,
Um,
I
great.
remember a time that I would really analyze, Bach's music by all the symbolism that's in the numerology. So many bars and so many this, and it's pretty mind-boggling how it's often constructed. But at the same time, even without knowing that, it's still emotionally mind-boggling. So that's part of the magic of it. It's so incredibly smartly structured, and at the same time, it's just drenched in emotion. It's just such an incredible combination that you hardly find anywhere in that level.
yeah, it's almost to me like the numerology pieces, or the some of the symbolism that's like in the graphic score itself, like the notes that form a crucifix when you sing Kreuzige or something like that.
Right.
That's almost like a part of the language that he's using. Like you start to, I mean, yes, you can go through and identify all these points and analyze, measure by measure, but it almost just becomes part of the air you breathe in singing this music. You come to expect it so much that it just is. It's almost like an accent to the music in some ways. Not to say that it doesn't have meaning, but that it just is an inherent part of the experience, I think.
Yeah, and one of the fun things I always like, and his how do you say this in English? Rhetorical knowledge, of course, was so much bigger. The whole rhetoric habits were so much bigger. And it's always fun to kind of figure out, you know, there's the word high or heaven, and the voice will go, oh, will go up, or it's like to the earth, and it's auf Erden, to the earth, all those kind of things with a lot of word painting that, if you think about it, it's just kind of smartly done, but it also has a very instinctive reaction for an audience to hear it that way, to just
Right.
hear it depicted. And I like, you know, kind of just being aware of those little things.
Well, and that's what stood out to me with Adam's presentation too, was the expressive nature of the music, which we all recognize when we see it, but kind of realizing how that was such a direct attempt at communication with the congregation, right? I mean, it was like drawing on, you know, popular tropes of the time, you know, what they might have experienced in the opera house, for example, you know, that kind of expression or expressionistic composition was just a part of the that was a part of the process for him from the very beginning. So I want to talk a little bit specifically about BWV 57 and what you find from David with maybe the bass parts, the bass recits and arias. What's noteworthy in this one? What's unusual to you, or what catches your ear or eye about this one, or about the subject itself? I one thing that Adam didn't mention is that this was written for the second Sunday of Christmas, right? But it is not a Christmas cantata. It's just that the second Sunday after Christmas, or the second day after Christmas, excuse me, happened to be the feast of St. Stephen. And Bach chose to ignore the Christmas tide and really focused on St. Stephen, which the story of St. Stephen is exactly a Christmas tale, right? So anyway, so what's noteworthy, David, about this cantata to you?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you were expecting to come to church and hear about happy little shepherds around the Christ child's cradle, you were sorely disappointed and dealing with martyrdom the whole day. So, Merry Christmas. One thing that I would say is a little bit different is if you think of like a normal Sunday cantata with like sort of an SATB arrangement, Bach uses his performing forces pretty judiciously and equally. So the bass is very often, I'm not going to say stuck with, but there's a few sorts of aria types that we tend to get quite frequently, and they tend to be a little bit patriarchal and a little bit martial. So the second bass aria is a very bass aria, but the dialogue cantatas are some of the places where we get to sing lyrically in Bach. And I can't tell you the number of times when I'm sitting there while the soprano's singing, and I'm going like, I want a tune. Because I have to sing all these like wide-ranging arpeggios and rapid scales, and
Right.
just
Bum bum bum
beautiful
bum 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 bum
sighing motives, and I'm like, I want legato. Yeah. So that's fun. The first aria is really interesting on a number of points. Calling it an aria even is like a little sticky, because if it doesn't really even have like an aria form, it's kind of aria, arioso-ish. But that's probably because he draws on a biblical text rather than one of those libretto texts. And if anyone has ever read like a biblical text, you'll know that it doesn't always tend to be that sort of immediate and punchy in an operatic way. Like opera libretti tend to be like, I feel feelings, rage, I will now rage, and then you do a rage aria. But biblical texts are a little bit more drawn out and contemplative. And this first aria is definitely that case when he's talking about blessed is the man who avoids temptation. And I think Bach had it in for his baritone, because I think the temptation was to breathe.
Resist.
To do before it's over. No. But in terms of talking about that inner relationship between like rhetoric and like punch you in the gut emotional quality, it's selig, 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 a sort of traditional like tripartite rhetorical exordium in one set. You could also hear it as like hearkening to that sort of Trinitarian tripartite arrangement. Also, it's a pretty pedal point against which Bach, master of harmony, can like place gnarly harmonies, which they're pretty twisty and chromatic. I think gnarly is a technical term. And yeah, I just get really long, unending lyrical lines, which I don't often get in an aria that isn't really an aria, that is an aria. And which, while we can talk about the way it relates to like theological interpretations or its relation to traditional rhetoric, is also just like this drop dead, gorgeous, emotionally immediate outpouring of feeling.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, part of the reason why we like Bach.
Oh, yes. That was a fantastic presentation on singing, being a bass singer of Bach. That's well summed up. So, Josephine,
Sorry,
what about?
long-winded.
No. It's good. It's great. It's gold. In fact, let me just tell you, it's gold. Josephine, so what about the soprano role in this cantata? What is it?
Well, a big part of it is the dialogue with Christ. Kind of, it feels to me a bit like someone just really thinking out loud with Christ, and I think that's how an audience can experience it. If I would have a sort of dialogue with this higher being, this is what it might be like, and this is how it would end emotionally. So the first aria, which is quite famous, basically says, I don't think a life without Christ is worth it. And, no matter if you're a Christian or any other spirituality, it's kind of the thought, a life needs to be lived on some kind of moral high ground. What is it without that? If you're not in a Christian sphere, I can imagine you might interpret it like that. That's a question I think every human being sort of asks themselves at times. So the aria, so without Christ or without this higher goal, it's really not worth anything. And then the second aria is really happy, especially if you look at the text. The text is basically, I am ready to die. I'm even envious, the recitative before that says, of people who are already dead, because they have the option to be with Christ. And it's a very bubbly, happy aria, kind of strengthening this faith of all will be well. If you believe in Christ and you follow that path, you will be rewarded in the end. And it's a strange juxtaposition of and it basically says, I'm happy to die. It's all great.
Yeah.
But I imagine in that time, especially, if you think of all the children that Bach lost, his first wife that he lost, but the whole Lutheran tradition being so steeped in death is just a painful transition to a nicer place. You can understand it. And these are kind of timeless questions and things I think we can all occupy ourselves with in a modern sort of way.
It's interesting because the last Vespers we did the motet Jesu meine Freude, and it has lots of the same themes in it. The whole motet is about the sort of a turning away from the world and a turning towards God, and I think, to be honest, I think that's a difficult concept for modern listeners to cope with in some ways. I think in your description of that aria that's very joyful and the text is I'm happy to die, I think that is hard for a lot of people to understand. And so I gave a little reflection about Jesu meine Freude, and I was trying to help maybe tap into something that would make this more relatable to people today, because I think that I'll go out on a limb and say that life in Leipzig in the early 18th century was less pleasant in general terms than life today, right? That we most people that you and I know are fortunate enough to live a more comfortable life, and I don't mean just materially. I just mean in medicine, modern medicine, in all sorts of ways, right? But that concept is difficult for modern audiences, and so it's one of the things that I think sometimes pushes people away from Bach's music, or any music of that time, is trying to understand and find how that is relevant to their own situation. And the way I've always done it, or the way I've tried to portray it to people, is actually captured inside of Jesu meine Freude, because the quote from Romans that's in there is about the world of the flesh and the world of the spirit. And the world of the flesh is the earthly life that is, that ends in death, whereas the world of the spirit is the eternal reward, so to speak. And I made the point that in my mind, that world of the flesh and the world of the spirit exists all around us in both ways. I used the quote from Solzhenitsyn where he said the line between good and evil is right down the middle of the human heart, right? And so that we're always faced with the choices to the world of the flesh and the world of the spirit. And for me, that's kind of how I interpret this cantata. We're getting a little into theology here, so I don't want to wade too far into that area. But for me, that's part of the interesting thing about a cantata like this. And of course, I love it when these cantatas have themes that grab a hold of us and kind of shake us a little bit. And I think martyrdom is certainly one of those ideas that's not on the tip of everyone's tongue. So
Yeah, but the whole life of, death was just more prevalent, but also a bit more visible, I think, than in our life. Our dead beloveds get kind of hidden away a little bit from us. We don't have that direct connection with them anymore. So I think might have just been easier to talk about those things in those days when it was so much clearer than now. It's a little bit hidden.
Right.
So it gets more scary the more hidden it is.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead, David. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was going to say that, I mean, we definitely live in a culture where death is taboo. And it is hard to think about death as like a thing that is ever present. And it was definitely, there was a pan-European cultural concern with not just what is a good life, which is very much like a philosophical concern since ancient Greece, but like, how do we live? I mean, how do we accomplish a good death? Like the ars moriendi was very much a topic of literature from the Renaissance well into what we consider the Baroque era. And even when you get into the 20th century, this idea of death being something removed from the life of we moderns or postmoderns, like even a thinker like Walter Benjamin in the 20s and the 1930s was saying that even now we're almost never in a room where death has happened. So it's easy to put it out of our mind and let it just be, rather than something that we deal with a taboo subject. So I mean, I think it's useful being confronted with something that is an inevitable fact, rather than just going,
but still in a positive sort of way. It gives it a
like
right.
how do
oh my
you
God, this is happening
how do you
every
approach
day,
this
but
inevitability?
it will be fine.
And we're trying to deal with it through the aesthetic, which is, I think, largely what the arts does, is we try and deal with big questions through the aesthetic realm rather than just words.
Well, I love to draw parallels to the blues as a genre, because the blues, the origin of the blues is in one of the most, inhuman types of existences you could imagine, which was slavery, right? And yet the kind of origin of that music was an attempt to maybe cope is too light of a word, but it arose out of that turmoil, out of that struggle, out of that pain, right? And so out of all of that, there was this art that was created. And now people still respond to the blues as a form of music, even if, regardless of what their life circumstances are, there's something in it we recognize, right? And I think in some ways, having an artistic expression of these kinds of ideas and these kinds of topics is one of the ways that we cope with it. It's one of the ways we prepare ourselves for it, right?
Yeah, it's not just coping with, it's processing, making artistic sausage from the gristly bits of life. Yeah.
Oh, okay. That's going to be that's going to be the title of this podcast. Say that again. Making
artistic sausage from the gristly bits of life.
Oh my gosh. That's why we have you on here, David. That's great. All right. Well, I tell you what, let's finish up with one last question for both of you. So I'll start, David, with you. I'm curious to know what other projects you've got going on in your world in addition to singing Bach with it in Cincinnati next week.
Well, getting my students to the end of the semester, both my voice students and my music history students. I'm a full-time lecturer at Butler at the moment. In my spare time, I'm practicing for some other gigs, like doing some Michael Haydn, a couple Passions, because we're coming up on Passion season. One with Washington Bach Consort and a few other places around town. And I'm working on 2 books. One of them is on singing Bach and how a non-specialist can make their way around a Bach score without going either completely insane, mostly just going completely insane and burning it. So how to avoid those outcomes. And the other one is I'm starting a biography on someone I talked about in my dissertation called Klaus Nomi, who is a crazy postmodern performance artist, club scene diva, cabaret, alien, hyphenated person in the late 70s and early 80s. If you want to go down a YouTube wormhole, Klaus Nomi, it's a good way to go.
Klaus Nomi.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay. That is fantastic.
Oh, yeah, you need this in your life.
So what are your projected timelines on the books? Are they close? Are they
summer? I will theoretically be able to make progress. That's my timeline.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Summer.
Yeah. But I've got a lot of research this summer, so that'll be nice because I've got some good archive time.
Excellent. And Josefien, I know you recently put out a CD, right?
Yes, actually I have it here, so I'll show you.
Yes.
I'm not sure if this is mirrored for you. It's Modern Muses. It's music for cello, contemporary music for just cello and voice. So this was all music that never had been commercially recorded before, and recorded it during the pandemic. It got accepted by a nice label called Navona Records. And last week it won a bronze medal in an international competition. So that's very nice.
That's excellent.
Yeah, there was a big project, and I'll be doing a lot of Bach. Actually, in March, I'll be in Arizona for a Bach festival, in Dayton, Ohio for a B minor mass. I'll be the artist in residence at the Boulder Bach Festival. I'll be in Corona del Mar doing some Handel and some Bach. And I'm a painter as well. That thing behind there is a painting that I did. And I'm finishing a children's book illustration. So that's a second project I'm doing.
Oh my gosh, both of you too. I mean, Adam, what are you going to do? My plans are to go to the grocery store, I think.
Yeah, go to the beach.
Yeah. Josefien, I was curious about the CD. Was most of that music commissioned, or was that music that was already existing for cello and voice?
It was a combination. We had several pieces that we had performed already that existed, that we found in libraries, sometimes even just a manuscript, never even been properly printed yet. Others wrote pieces for us, hearing about our projects, and some already have existed for several years. But it's a nice combination of things. There are composers from New Zealand, Norway, Italy, England, Germany, the Netherlands, the States, several female composers. So a whole wide variety of things. And I also painted the portraits of all the separate composers, which was a nice sort of social media boost. And I got some new skills with that, so that's good.
Yeah, I got my copy and I love it. It's a fantastic
yes, you
recording.
supported us, so thank you. God.
I did. I was happy to do it. So, well, that's fantastic. Well, everyone, Adam, Josefien, David, thank you so much for joining me for this Bach Talk. This is one of the best ones we've had. We've got to get this quartet together again to talk some more. So, So anyway, everyone who is listening, I hope that you can join us this coming Sunday for Bach Vespers. If you need more information about that, you can go to bachensemble.org and you can find all of the information about that. And please spread the word. We'd love to see lots of folks there. We had a record attendance at our last Vespers. We here in Cincinnati are in a very good place for COVID. Things are looking very good for us. And so we had a record attendance that rivaled pre-COVID for the first time in 2 years.
Yay.
So yeah, so I was pretty excited to see that. So, all right. Well, I guess with that, thank you all and have a great evening.
Thank you, Carlton. Thank you, everyone, for listening.
Thank you.